Welcome back to A Book Binger. My name's Shelby, and I am a girl who is binging a new book each week instead of binging Netflix. Let's get started on this week's book. If you haven't heard about Anchor by Spotify, it's the easiest way to make a podcast, with everything you need all in one place. Let me explain. Anchor has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. When hosting on Anchor, you can distribute your podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, and more. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. And best of all, Anchor is totally free. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Hello, fellow book lovers. Another week, another book. This week's book is recommended by Jack. He has his own podcast along with Fish called Bushwhacking. You can listen to them on Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and more. I recommend tuning in to their latest episode where they have a variety of topics that they bushwhack. His recommendation was Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. Here is the book blurb. In the year 2044, reality is an ugly place. The only time teenage Wade Watts really feels alive is when he's jacked into the virtual utopia known as the Oasis. Wade's devoted his life to studying the puzzles hidden within this world's digital confines. Puzzles that are based on their creator's obsession with the pop culture of decades past and that promise massive power and fortune to whoever can unlock them. But when Wade stumbles upon the first clue, he finds himself beset by players willing to kill to take this ultimate prize. The race is on, and if Wade's going to survive, he'll have to win and confront the real world he's always been so desperate to escape. I'm so excited to be talking about this book with Jack, and this is his favorite book. And I haven't read much sci-fi fantasy before, so let's dive in. All right. Well, welcome, Jack, to A Book Binger.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to have you on.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
I know we've talked about this for a while, doing this book, so... And I have been very adamant of not talking about it before we record this podcast.
Yes, you have. It's been kind of annoying because I couldn't talk to you about it for a long, long time, but now we can.
So Jack and I decided to read Ready Player One. Oh my gosh, it had to have been about 2 months ago, right? Where we decided we would read this.
Yeah, we decided about 2 months ago, but then we both finished it, I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago.
I think it was 2 weeks ago where we both finished it. So we have both been mulling over this topic of Ready Player One for a while now, and we've kept our mouths shut. So now we're going to unleash all of our thoughts and ideas on this book, which for me is a lot. And I don't want to say too much about you, but I'm pretty sure you have just as much to say.
I probably have hours to say about Ready Player One.
Well, I guess we better start. So I just needed to say that for me, the book was absolutely incredible. I didn't think that I would get this involved with it because I'm not big into science fiction. And then I just devoured this book because I knew that you loved it so much, and then I wanted to see what the movie was like because everyone has raved about the movie. And I'm not really going to talk too much about that comparison because it absolutely sucked. The movie was terrible because I loved the book so much. But anyway, for the book, I just wanted to know, I guess, how did you come across Ready Player One?
I came across Ready Player One with my friend Fish and his family because he was the youngest of his family by a few years. And so the majority of his siblings, aunts and uncles were basically raised during the 80s and the early 90s. And if you've read Ready Player One, you know that the majority of the references within it are towards 80s and maybe some late 90s pop culture references. And so he got into it because they were enthralled with it. They had contests on who could experience the most 80s pop culture stuff. So I heard from Fish, and then I got into it, and then I joined the contest. I think I maybe got like 15th place. But I did really good. I went to an old arcade, and I would play all the old games on the old cabinets, and I would listen to the music. Yeah, it was great. And then I kind of had the same experience when I watched the movie. I was just a little bit disappointed.
Well, so for those who haven't read Ready Player One, it's about this kid who pretty much lives in poverty, and the entire world almost is enthralled in this, what do you call it?
Well, it's virtual reality, but
Yes.
it's a singular game. It started out as a single game called The Oasis, but then it transformed into something completely different than what it was intended. It became a virtual reality where people would essentially live,
Yeah.
because they would have their social media on the Oasis. They would have games on the Oasis, and it was a fully immersive video game where everything was basically created.
And the world that this boy lives in, I guess he's not really a boy, but he's a teenager. He's starting to graduate from high school. And the world that they live in, the real world, it's pretty bad. There's a lot of impoverished people. There's a lot of hunger. It's not a good time to pretty much be alive. The world is just corrupted and crumbling. And even in the Oasis, they started to have school and jobs. That was where you would mainly get a job, as if you worked in the Oasis. And for him, he didn't have all of the power-ups that he could use to travel and become something else other than just a school-attending person in this Oasis. Mm-hmm. So he spent all of his time at his high school, pretty much. But there was this gentleman, his name is Halliday, James Halliday, and he created the Oasis, and there was an Easter egg that he had hidden. And so there was this giant treasure hunt trying to find this Easter egg. And for those of you who don't know what an Easter egg is, I'm sure Jack is more than capable of explaining it better than I am.
So an Easter egg, in terms of video games or even movies, it's a short snippet. Actually, it can come in many forms. The first, this is a history. The first Easter egg ever placed was actually the creator's name in the game Adventure. And this was when developers were widely unknown. People didn't know who created their own video games. They only knew it was made by Atari or Konami or whatever corporation, but the name of the developer was actually hidden. So, without the people knowing, this guy put his name into the game Adventure, and that was the first Easter egg. And today, Easter eggs can come in many forms like that. It can be kind of a cameo. It can be anything. But in this universe, James Halliday, the creator of the Oasis, basically just created a golden ticket contest where if you found his Easter egg through solving these clues and figuring out the challenges, you inherited his fortune and his claim on the Oasis and his entire stock in his company.
Yeah, and so for this guy, that was a huge turning point for his life. He felt like, I've been obsessed with James Halliday my entire life. Pretty much he worships him, right?
Ever since the ever since the contest came out. Because he didn't know James Halliday very well until the contest came out, and then he learned everything he could get his hands on.
Yeah, because he figured I could definitely be the one to win this fortune. I could do it. And I love what they call themselves. They call themselves Gunters, are these people who are so dedicated in finding the Easter egg. And I can't for the life of me remember how that came about. I know there was like a 2-word phrase.
Egg hunter.
Egg hunter. That's right. And so then all these people joined together to become Gunters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so it's just an abbreviation of egg hunters. They just call them Gunters.
Yeah. So anyway, we could just tell the whole story, but I don't want to do that on this podcast. I want you guys to go and get Ready Player One because I think everybody needs to read it. Especially for me, though, I didn't grow up knowing too much about 80s culture. My stepdad, he for sure loves anything 80s, and my mom is pretty immersed in the 80s culture. But I didn't grow up with it, so I didn't know too many of the references. That was just one thing for me that was a little bit difficult reading the book. But I mean, other than that, it was just little things here and there where I didn't quite catch on, but if I looked it up, it made sense. Mm-hmm. And so I could see that being probably something for a lot of people out there, but I encourage you to go read it. And now Jack and I are going to kind of talk about what made this book so special for us and why we liked it so much. So Jack, my first question to you is obviously, who's your favorite character?
My favorite character?
Yes.
I think obviously I connect with Wade Watts because I kind of have viewed myself as him. In fact, before watching the movie, I think I imagined me as like, when I imagined what he looked like, I kind of just put myself in his place. And I've done that with other books that I've read, but mostly on an emotional level, just trying to connect. But I think with Wade Watts, it's like, yeah, I'm Wade Watts.
I could see that as a geeky teenager who's sitting all by himself, immersed in video games.
But I think my favorite character might be Og Morrow.
Really?
Yeah, just because James Halliday, even I have a fascination with James Halliday, even though he's a fictional character. But Og Morrow, I think is kind of the word of caution guy. You know, he is the smarter one as far as like the wisdom of the Oasis. Not saying like James Halliday was a complete idiot at all, but Morrow just kind of had a more level head of like, this is what we're actually creating.
Oh, for sure.
Because James Halliday used it as an escape, which Wade Watts also uses it as an escape to, even though the world kind of sucks, it's a pretty unhealthy way of doing it. But it makes sense because one, Wade Watts and James Halliday had really, really kind of crappy lives, and particular on the social level where they just couldn't really connect with people very well outside of the Oasis. Whereas Og Morrow, while still a complete geek, I mean, his house was made to look like Rivendell.
Yeah.
But even he could see like the limits of how good this universe he created was becoming, and he was like, you know what? Like, I'm gonna kind of stay out of it. But then when he still felt like he needed to intervene, he did.
Yeah.
So I think Og Morrow was actually my favorite character.
Yeah. Well, and compared to James and Wade, like you said, I feel like Og was more layman's term normal. Like, he didn't have that obsessive factor in his life as much as James and Wade did. He was kind of a little bit more level-headed. And like it mentions, he was more of the marketing side than anything. And I think that also has to play a role in his character of not being as overly obsessive with it. And he hadn't even logged into the Oasis as much as James and Wade did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could see that for sure. So I think my favorite character, I've been thinking about this a lot. I loved all of the main characters, but I think I loved H.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a spoiler alert I'm going to put on. So if you guys don't want to listen about it, you better log off right now. But I liked H as a dude.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, when I was reading it, so they spell H's name A-E-C-H. And my brain always just said it as Ek. And I knew it was meant as H because they explain it. It's like the letter H, but it's spelled A-E-C-H. So every time I read it, it was Ek. I don't know why. But he was as equally obsessed, I think, as Wade Watts. And they were best friends, but H had more power-ups. He had more availability to the Oasis than just the schoolyard. He was also known as this big-time...
he was a deathmatch champion.
Yeah,
Deathmatch and capture the flag champion, which even today are still very...
impressive.
They're competitive games, particularly in the game Halo. I know capture a flag.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it in Call of Duty or Battlefield, but in Halo, it's a very popular game mode, and deathmatch is universal.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's how H got all of his money.
Yeah, he's very popular in the Oasis. And for him to become best friends with Wade Watts was kind of like, what are you doing, H? Why are you hanging out with this loser? He's got 0 power-ups, he's got no money. He has the basic Avatar skin because he can't afford anything else. But H is just drawn to Wade by his obsession with James Halliday and the Easter egg. That is what really ties them together. So they spend all of their time doing quote-unquote research together, which is listening to all the 80s songs, watching all the movies, playing all the video games together. They're individual gunters themselves, so they don't pair up to try to find the Easter egg together, but they love everything that James Halliday has been obsessed with, so that really bonds their friendship.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I was really upset how they portrayed H in the movie because that is not how I pictured H at all in the book. I pictured H as it's described, he's this tall white dude. And in the book, it explains as well that is intentional because there's this understanding that white men are privileged. And as H in the real world, she is a black girl. Mm-hmm. And she grew up with the mindset, and her mom put this into her mind that white men get what they need and what they want. And so her avatar in the Oasis was that white man. Mm-hmm. Which in turn, it did show a lot of success for herself, becoming a really popular gamer. But that was one thing that really made me upset in the movie was how they portrayed H.
Yeah, it kind of, whenever I saw the trailers for Ready Player One, I was like, who is this ogre?
Yeah.
And everybody was like, that's H. I was like, no, why?
Yeah.
And I think everything, this is talking about the movie. I think everything other than that was fine about H. I thought the character was fine, but it just did throw me off of this is not the H I imagined. But then again, it wasn't the Wade Watts or the Artemis that I imagined in the movie.
That's true.
In the book, I loved H because he and Wade Parzival, they geeked out over the same things. And yes, it was part of the gunting, but it was also just that culture that they fell in love with. And when I think about my relationship with Fish, it's the exact same.
Yeah.
Where we don't necessarily geek out over the 80s specifically, but we do like a lot of the stuff that came from the 80s because of Ready Player One. But we also love the stuff that came from our generation, the 90s and the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. And we geek out over that stuff. And if you were to take that away from our relationship, we'd still have some stuff to talk about, but not nearly as much.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I like that about the book because that made it extremely authentic to me, because as a fellow geek, you want to geek out with other people.
Right.
It is kind of a lonely thing sometimes because you don't find too many people to geek out over. But this is the same with sports or video games, music, whatever. When you find somebody who you can geek out with, all of a sudden that bond is there. Rich
Yeah.
or poor, black or white, bond or free.
Absolutely. Well, another question I had that I've been dying to talk about is the three, what are they called? It's blanking my mind.
Well, you got the 3 keys and you have the 3 gates.
Yeah, just the three, what is it called?
Challenges?
Yes, thank you. The 3 challenges. So I have been dying to talk about the 3 challenges with you because I thought they were so genius. It blew my mind. Every time he brought up a new challenge, it was like, this is so cool. This is so smart. And obviously, like, these challenges were meant to be hard because he's giving away his fortune. And so he's not just going to make it easy for everybody, but he really wants the best person to have his fortune. And so the first one, it took, 5 years until they even found a clue?
I think it was 5 years, yes.
Yeah.
Until someone could actually figure it out.
Yeah. And so I kind of thought at first, so the first clue was in the world that Parzival, or Wade Watts, Parzival is his avatar's name. So the first clue was in his world, which he couldn't leave his world, right? And at first I was like, okay, well, that's kind of cheesy. Like, make it easy for him. Obviously, he's meant to be the winner then. But, as they explained it, it made more sense. And the way that it was hidden in that world was also like, well, no wonder they didn't find it for 5 years. That's hard.
Yeah.
Just to go tromping in some random forest in the school world, like, people aren't just going to do that for fun.
Yeah, and the other thing with that, too, is it was a full access world. Anybody could go there. And I did kind of think maybe it was a little bit cheesy, but the thing about James Halliday and how he wanted the Oasis to be is that he didn't want it to be, in gamer terms, a pay-to-win kind of thing. Now, we can argue about that all day because you still had to pay your fares. But when you look at how IOI wanted to run the world, they wanted it to be a fully pay-to-win kind of situation.
Right.
Because to buy, I believe it was to buy an Oasis account, it was 25 cents. And that was mostly as a gimmick, not as an actual, actual pricing for marketing. But James Halliday did that because he wanted the 25 cents to be a reminder of the original roots of gaming, which was those old consoles, those old cabinets,
Yeah.
And so at first it was a little bit like, yeah, that's kind of weird that it was on his planet. But after a while, especially the second time reading it, I was like, okay, now I can kind of see, especially when I realized that Artemis was actually the very first to solve the puzzle.
Yeah,
Because
that's
it wasn't Parzival. If Parzival was the very first one to figure it out, it would have made it would have been more cheesy. But when I realized that Artemis was the very first one to figure out what the clue meant, but Parzival was the first one to beat the challenge, then it was like, okay, that makes a little more sense.
Yeah, and I did like that too. I also think, like, about Artemis and her feelings. How mad would you be that you were the first one to get to this gate and you had been there she was there for 2 whole weeks, right? Every day she was trying to beat this stupid challenge. And then all of a sudden just comes in this dude one day and he beats it right off the first bat. Like, I would be so mad. And reading the book, I could just see how ticked off she was. Like, what the heck? I have been doing this all by myself. I was the only one here. I knew it. And you just waltz in and you take it.
Well, to her credit, she used all of her time to figure out the riddle, where Wade Watts did the exact same thing, but he had the advantage to where he was playing Joust, which was the first challenge for years before actually beating the Lich. But Artemis had just barely started playing Joust once the challenge became apparent.
Yeah.
And so, and that was the other thing about James Halliday, is that he wanted people to like what he liked.
Yeah.
And which is interesting, because I think if I were to make a challenge like this, I'd probably do the exact same thing, where I would want people to like what I like and not only know the facts, but be skillful at the games and stuff, because
I feel like yours would include a lot of fishing.
I don't know. If I did something virtual like golfing. In the Oasis, I don't know. Maybe in a real life challenge. Like if I actually hit an actual treasure out in the actual world, I probably would have challenges like golf and fishing. But if it were in a virtual reality, I probably would have like old games that people probably don't even remember, like
or like old cartoons.
Yeah, like Gizmos and Gadgets was one of my first video games.
Oh.
And it was an old kind of learning game, and I would definitely have that in the challenge somewhere. But yeah, I sympathize with Artemis, where you were the first one. I think she was alone in the challenge for 5 weeks, something like that, before Parzival.
I thought it was 2 weeks.
She lied the first time.
With him?
Mm-hmm. She lied the first time. She said it was like 3 weeks, but it ended up being like 5 or 6.
That's right, because she had just met this guy and she wasn't going to give more away.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But yeah, so, I mean, just right off the bat, the challenge was hard. And then the second challenge, it made more sense, which I feel like, it shouldn't be that big of a gap anyway between the first and the second one. So it was a little bit easier for me to grasp that.
Are you talking about the key to the gate? Or are you talking about the copper key to the crystal key?
No, yeah, the key to the gate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I really liked in the book rather than the movie too, because in the movie it was, you complete this challenge, here's the gate and key right there. But in the book, it's complete this challenge and then you have to go find the key.
No. You have to, gate. You find the challenge, you get the key, and then you have to find where the gate is. Yeah. You have to find out where to key in. Exactly. And then there's a challenge for that as well.
Yeah. And I really liked that in the book because it made it more of a challenge. It made it harder. It made it also, though, there was a variety in the content that James Halliday was putting in. So it wasn't all just solely based on a video game. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't solely just based on, or music, It had music, video games, movies. It had artifacts. It had all of these things that were a part of James Halliday's life. Even there was one where it was his home, like his childhood home that they had to go into, and it was a complete replica of everything. And I really loved the book because he put so much detail into all of these things. And it was as if the author himself was James Halliday, which in turn he is. But, there was so much detail. You would have thought that this guy was, literally a scholar on everything 80s, which that's what, I would say he is.
Ernest Cline?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think, and that's just truth with all authors, I feel, is that even if the character that you're creating is like the complete opposite of you, it's still a mirror of yourself, even if it's the antithesis of your personality. But in this case, Ernest Cline owns a freaking DeLorean, which would be my dream if I had that choice. And I think when Wade Watts and when the High Five, when they're going through the Oasis trying to find the Easter egg, it really paints a picture as to who James Halliday is. Mm-hmm. And we won't talk about it now, but it goes even deeper in Ready Player 2 of who James Halliday is. And I think that's very creative as an author, because the challenge isn't just this entertaining action movie style book, but the challenge really paints a picture as to who James Halliday is and what was important to him. Because there was a time, and this is another spoiler, but there's a time where Wade Watts wondered why in the world would James Halliday make a replica of his old hometown. I think it's Middletown or Middleton. And he was like, why would he do that if it was so depressing for him? But then it kind of explains that, well, even though it was depressing, like, that's where things kind of came to light. That's where he met Ogden, and that's where he met Karen or Kira.
Kira.
Well, Kira was the name that she changed, but her real name was
Kira.
after she changed it.
Oh.
Yeah, her real name was Karen.
That's right.
But then she changed it legally to Kira, which was
Yeah.
from, she got that from the Dark Crystal.
That's right. Yeah.
And so, but it kind of, looking into my life, I was like, that's kind of true. Like, when I look at the times of my life, even though they were dark, there were still those hidden gems that were so important to me. And I don't know if I would go to the extent of putting it in a virtual reality, but because the Oasis was literally James Halliday's world,
Yeah.
and because he went into the effort of not only putting it into the Oasis, but making, like hundreds of copies of it and making it part of the challenge, it was kind of a path into James Halliday. It wasn't just I'm going to see how many people love the Holy Grail. It's like, no, like, it's kind of his life.
Yeah.
And something he couldn't tell people about his life story very well.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like
You have to show people.
It was kind of like the Easter egg hunt was him telling them about his life. Maybe not completely, but there's some very key elements of his life that are in the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, we could talk about this all day long, but is there something specifically that you were dying to talk about?
I think there's a lot, honestly.
I know. It's just such a good book, and every part of it was good. I didn't see one point that, made me upset. Like, there's always a part where you're like, no, not that. But I mean, like, upset, like, oh, why would you put that in a book? I don't think there was any part where I was disappointed, honestly. I think all of it, like I said, I don't really fall toward science fiction books. And this book, I finished it in 3 days. I was enthralled. I was just absolutely amazed at how easy it was for me to get into it and how easy it was for me to visualize it. I don't think there was one part where I was disappointed.
I don't think I was disappointed in the book. There's always some things where I was like, I wonder why they put that in. But one thing I'd like to ask the author maybe is, was this just a book just for fun of like, ooh, what if the world was coming to an end, and that would be a good reason to put in virtual reality to make it like something this popular? Because if the Oasis was here today, I don't think it would be nearly this popular.
Yeah.
Just because the world is still good. Like, you can go outside and you can find open space and breathe clean air. And I won't get into arguing about that, but you can still do things outside. Whereas in this world of Wade Watts, doing that is out of the question.
Yeah.
Like, he had to take an armored car from Oklahoma to Columbus just to be safe. Whereas now it's like, yeah, we don't have that problem.
Right.
It can just be us two with no weapons or just our tiny sedan. Just roam across the country. We'll be safe,
Yeah.
So I would want to ask him, like, do you believe this is where the world is coming? Or was this just a setting that you believed would be ideal for a virtual reality to thrive? Because in that setting, yeah, absolutely, that would almost be essential. But today I was like, no, like, it would be popular for sure. A lot of people would want to be in it, but I don't think it would be as popular today just because the real world is still alive.
Yeah.
But that would be my question to him, is like, Was this a warning of you thinking that this is where the world is headed, or was this purely artistic?
Yeah.
And either way, it would just be interesting to know, because on an artistic level, it's brilliant.
Absolutely.
But it's just the way he wrote it made it seem like, is this where you believe the world is going?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I don't think I've ever thought about it that way. So, as our listeners, if you feel that same way, if you want to know what the author was thinking, share this podcast. Let's share it, and maybe he'll come across it. It's always doubtful. But if there's any other questions that you have for Jack and I, we'd love to talk about it. Like I said, we could talk probably for days about this book. Mm-hmm. And for sure, after this podcast, you better believe that Jack and I are going to still be talking about this book. Yeah, finally. But like I said, go get this book, Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. It's a science fiction. It's amazing. It's full of 80s pop culture. And I want to know what you guys think of it. So please listen, subscribe, and we will see you next week.
What a fun discussion Jack from Bushwhacking and I had about the book Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. I personally recommend it to everybody, especially those who loved the motion picture. I loved the book way more, as many book readers do. Again, please don't forget to subscribe. We have a new episode that comes out each week. I'd love to bring you guys on. If you have a book you're super passionate about, please let me know. I love books. Please don't forget to visit our website, also our social media platforms. Again, I'm just a girl who's binging books instead of Netflix. Have a good week, you guys.